Hey guys, this is Tyler here from Estonia, and we are at the beginning of December now, so we are getting closer to the new year, and it's been a crazy year for me, but hopefully everyone has been doing all right, and I think it's awesome, honestly, the growth in our community, and it's going to be really cool, honestly, the next year to come. I have some big projects coming up, so I'm going to talk to everyone here about the growth of MGTOW in Austria. Now, I've spoken about MGTOW in Germany, and I think Germany, as I've mentioned, was a major growth country of MGTOW in Europe. And I also believe that Austria has been significant. It, of course, is a much smaller country, but it has been very important. And as we know, I think Germanic and Scandinavian countries often set a certain precedence or course for the rest of Europe. They play a very influential role. Even when we look at the European Union, a lot of the early policies of the European Union was driven by the Germanic countries. They had a lot of influence on some of these facets, for good or bad. Now, Austria, of course, is a country of just under 10 million people. The population hasn't risen very much over the past 3 or 4 decades. It's actually risen pretty little, and unfortunately, the population as a whole has been on the older side. It's a more aging population. This is actually one of the first reasons why MGTOW philosophy has really started booming in Austria, is just the lack of dating options. I mean, the average guy doesn't have a lot of options to choose from. And as we know, when there's more options given to the other group, the woman, it creates a very difficult situation. And this is certainly the case in Austria, that women are very hypergamous and they're always going to be going for the guys at the top. And this is certainly the case in Austria. It's important also just to understand the Germanic mindset. It's not as egalitarian by nature, I think, as we see over in Eastern Europe. It's different in this sense. I think it's both individualistic and communal at the same time, if that makes sense. Austria is kind of, in some respect, I think a little better than Germany, because from my research, it seems like Austrians tend to meet and be in relationships with the people they grew up with in their towns or cities. Austria, of course, is made up of mostly smaller towns, with the exception of their capital and another 1 or 2 minor cities. Vienna and Salzburg are probably the 2 most well-known places in Austria on both the eastern and western side of the country. I myself have been to Eastern Austria. I've been to Vienna. It's a beautiful city, amazing place. And I will say that when I went there, I didn't feel it was as bad. I was kind of expecting to see probably a little more degeneracy and more lack of respect from the women there. But honestly, I found the Austrians more pleasant than the Slovak women. They were truthfully more, I think, more genuine. I met one get shop, and I mean, she seemed very interested in going on a date. Unfortunately, I only had 1 day there, so I couldn't go on a date. I got her number, and I followed up, and she responded, and she was totally game on going on a date. It was like really surprising to me, but I found I connected quite well with Austrian women. So anything, I think some of it also depends on the person. I think some guys there's more appeal factor with one guy to the next. I think that's really critical to understand here. Unfortunately, Austria has faced some of the same issues that we see in Germany and other European Union countries. That's had quite an impact on the state of both relationships and this dynamic between genders. Many people may have heard of this 1979 equal treatment law, and this was set up for quote-unquote equal pay, promotion, non-sexual discrimination, and harassment in the workplace. This was established by the Austrian government because they felt there was not enough equality at the time. And this actually kind of reminds me of Title IX in the US. This bill, it was installed, and they certainly made a lot of changes to the public sector. I don't think, though, as much in the private sector, this impacted the society as much as we saw over in the US or Canada. There's another law that came after, known as the Women's Omnibus Law of 1993, which was an increase in government type of jobs. This bill entailed that any government agency in Austria would have to have a staff of at least 40% women. This would be in education, in police, in political scene, in any type of human services, any of these government jobs, they would have to have at least 40% women. I think this probably wasn't as much of a stretch for them because, I mean, we could certainly look at in other countries like in US, Canada, even here in Estonia, it's a very large percentage of public sector jobs are filled by women. So this one was probably pretty easy and didn't impact their country as much as other bills. They also stated that women had been denied promotion because of gender and quote-unquote harassment. Also understand that the concept of equal treatment in Austria, as people may hear in the US, is a little different than in Anglo countries. What they see as equal treatment is probably more in line with the Germanic school of thought, that outside of the home or in the home, there's a high level of respect in many different job sectors. That's important to understand. And in Germanic countries, whether you're in the military, you're a carpenter, you're an engineer, a business person, teacher, I think of most countries in the world, they actually probably have the highest general level of respect for any person. It doesn't matter what sector they're working in. And this is one of the reasons why for some people Germany works or Austria works, others not. I mean, if you want to be one of these big industrialist entrepreneurs with mega wealth and just a huge amount of influence in society, Austria is probably not going to be the place that you would want to be. But if you're fine being like a carpenter or a teacher, whatever it is, and you know you'll get a decent level of respect, this probably would be a good place. But understand too that in Austria, this concept of unpaid work, also this in the home situation, basically it's what in the US these sociologists would identify as the second shift. When women got off of work and came home, they would have to do all these other duties. This is a term I know that started becoming bigger in the 1990s. It's basically their version of the unpaid shift in Austria. And this concept was an attempt for the Austrian government to try to create an extra tax with funds designated to certain areas, basically in areas that would be for the benefit of women because they maybe were unable to go into the work. Also, though, keep in mind that in Austria, when this law was being discussed, this was before a lot of the IT work, remote jobs. We certainly didn't have a COVID situation. So it kind of made sense why this would have been discussed. This was before a lot of the technology and innovation came around. I think if they were to fast forward, say 20 years, 25 years, this would have probably not been even proposed because, of course, now many people work remote and many women can do jobs that don't require them to spend as much time in an office and still get paid pretty well. That's important to note here, but this was a bill that was very ahead of its time. At that time, also educated, college educated, women were much more preferred, and also ones that had work experience. It was much more difficult for women without work experience in the 1980s to get work. So that was one of the mindsets behind this bill, that it would just, I guess, be for the greater good of society, as they said. Now, also understand, though, Austria was a country up until very recently. Unlike in Germany, they did not have the same influx of immigrants like they had as we saw in Germany or in Scandinavia. So percentage-wise of their population, Austrians still saw their country as being a country of Austrians. As Europeans, maybe they got people from Eastern Europe, from neighboring Slavic countries, or from some other places, but it wasn't very many. And that was one of the benefits, I think, in Austria, that they were able to retain a very Germanic feel until quite recently, which is cool. I mean, many people may realize that some of the most prominent German speakers or people of the Germanic culture have actually came from Austria. And that's just crazy to think. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the famous actor, he was Austrian, he wasn't German. And there's been others like him that where they actually came from the Austria, and often Austria was identified as being more nationalist in the first part of the 20th century, which I think is similar to what we'd see in the U.S. If you went, say, further into the Rust Belt or the Midwest, you went into North Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota. Historically, that region of the U.S. was probably much more nationalistic than, say, a place like New York or New Jersey. It's, I think, kind of the same thing there. Austria also, of course, has had a pretty high standard of living and also fairly high income. So of all the European countries, Austria has generally been right at the top, typically in the top 5 countries. And this is, of course, had a big impact on the relations, on gender relations. That, as we can see in other places, anytime the two genders make a similar average income, or women can make a pretty high amount of money, it seems to always have quite an impact on the possibility of relationship and marriage. They, of course, also have this type of work climate. Of course, it makes it more challenging for a guy because they're not going to be valued as much for their work. They're going to be more valued on how they entertain, their status, on different, more trivial factors here. When we look over now to areas like divorce and child custody, marriage, this is an area where Austria actually is probably a little better than many other European countries, and certainly Anglo countries. Many actually have a little more favor in the court system. They don't get as mistreated, surprisingly enough. And often there's kind of an implied notion that men are entitled to a certain amount of custody of their children. They fortunately have a better system in place here. Any Austrians here can testify to this, that it's not as bad as England and Canada. And I think they're also more aware of this parental alienation concept. They understand this is alive and well, and they don't want this type of problem being very mainstream. Like I said, Austrians, like other Germanic groups, aren't as individualistic, and this is really important to account for when it comes to the parental relationship and with their children. And that probably actually helps in this sense, because it means that men are not just simply valued for the work they do or the money they bring to the table. They are also valued on how good of a parent they are. And the courts fortunately understand that it's little that men do have value, and they're important to a degree for their kids. So that's one thing to note about Austria. Now, is the court system biased against men? Certainly, it sure is. But is it as bad as, say, England, Canada? Absolutely not. It's not. And now, if someone is foreign, it's very common. Austrians recently have started marrying or just simply having kids with foreign guys or foreign women. Yes, in this situation, it can start getting complicated, especially if the person is from a non-EU country or even EU country, because then how the court system evaluates situations is different. And they often are going to always give precedence to the Austrian, to the person that's in the country. That's how it usually works. Also note that Austrians have had a longer history, I think, of a homesteading that's more where house duties are more shared. Probably the 1990s, it was a fairly high percentage of men that were doing housework and chores, just like the women. They were very much helping manage things in the house and cooking and cleaning and helping their children and stuff much earlier on than I think in other places. And this probably also actually helped in their country, because even though I don't think this is the most ideal situation, I think in the context of this country and their culture, I do think it worked to a degree, because there was an understanding that they certainly were valuable in the home, they were valuable for their kids, and having this balance of duties was probably going to be more beneficial than not. I mean, the woman in this sense would actually probably have a little more respect for the guy in this situation, because as I said, this is Germanic culture, this isn't Anglo culture, this isn't Italian culture, and in this sense it probably was more beneficial when they went into a court, because if the person did want a divorce or she wanted more child custody, the guy could be like, well, I'm doing this, and it would show the court, okay, this guy has brings a lot of value. And just guys on a whole, there was naturally going to be less bias, and they were going to be guaranteed to receive more custody from the get-go. So it actually worked out in their favor. That's key to understand here. Now, the education system has been pretty decent in Austria, but with that being said, the social aspects of the education and certain political agendas that have been driven have been disastrous, starting from a young age. While Austrians on a whole tend to be pretty intelligent people, it has not been good from the social angle in terms of agendas that are driven from pre-kindergarten up through university, and young people obviously are saturated with these ideals. They're in these very formidable years, and Austria certainly hasn't been the exception. This started becoming very common in the 1980s, and it's persisted to this day. Way of teaching and education, just like in Western countries, has been very focused and driven on both the indoctrination and also the not distinguishing between genders, and making it clear that there are differences, and customizing education per those differences, and this is definitely the case here. In the EU, of course, has these agendas in mind and desire to continue driving these in all the respective EU countries. So this is one of the big problems that some Central European countries have been trying to combat, but it does continue to be an issue in schools up to this day. And the last major problem here, I think, is just the fact that Austria is a landlocked Central European country. This is often a big problem anywhere in the world, but especially in Europe. Any of these smaller landlocked countries, they face a lot of influence from all the countries around them, and bigger countries, the US, Canada, and whatever is going on over there. And it does kind of draw them away from following their natural traditions and customs and religion, and instead looking to these other places, these bigger countries, that for their source of influence. This is the case for sure in Austria. It's what it is. Now, on a side note though, Austria has in recent times had decent relationships with countries like Russia, and I think also Hungary. Their relations will continue to improve. So in the near future, if they continue to better position themselves with both Germany and Russia, it could certainly improve, and the state of their country could slowly get better. As I said before, Austria, it's not in a great position, but it's not in a terrible position. It's a relatively good economy. They don't have a great situation, but it's not too terrible. And I think it's that their leadership is a little more based. They have leaders that I think are actually more proud of their Austrian heritage and roots. They certainly have been a big player in innovation and technology, just like in Germany. They've been very pivotal in many of these fields, and also medicine. This is one of the also key areas in this country, and that's actually also been a big important area for Austria because they don't have a lot of natural resource. They've relied more on these sort of sectors to help grow their economy and grow. So Austria, it's not the worst MGTOW country, but it's also not a great. It'll be very interesting to see how it progresses in Austria. If you're interested in a Germanic country, you want to learn German, and you're interested in this part of the world, focus on Austria probably more than Germany. I think Austria is a better bet here, and you can also there's also great terrain and landscape, and you may actually enjoy some of these aspects also of the country. So this is my take on Austria here, so give me your feedback below. Thank you.